Hello, and welcome to the inaugural Semper Curious Colloquium. This will be the first of an ongoing series of informal afternoon discussions in which a featured guest speaker takes us inside their field of research. My name is Micah Dubroy, and I'm the editorial lead here at Semper Curious. With us today is Dr. Darby Saxbe, who's here to discuss the physiological impacts of social relationships. Dr. Saxbe is Associate Professor of Psychology at the University of Southern California, where she runs the Neuroendocrinology of Social Ties, or NEST laboratory. Her current research focuses on hormones, brain, and behavioral changes over the transition to parenthood. Welcome, Dr. Saxbe. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm very happy to be here.
So for the title of this, you posed a question. How do close relationships get under our skin? Could you maybe start by sort of unpacking that and tell us what you mean by that kind of question?
Yeah, absolutely. So let me first say, we know that the relationship context really matters for health, right? So traditionally, psychology has focused on the individual as the unit of analysis, right? We look at the mental states, the physiological states of a single individual, possibly over time. But as the field has gotten more sophisticated, we've gotten interested in what's happening between people, what kinds of states are shared between individuals within close relationships. And it's been said that close social relationships are as important for lifelong health as diabetes, obesity, smoking, right? We know that people who are more socially isolated, that's one of the highest risk factors for all-cause mortality. People who are married live longer than people who are single. People who say that they have close social support networks tend to live longer than people who say that they're lonely. And so relationships really matter, starting in infancy when we emerge into, a web of relationships in which we're totally embedded, and really continuing across the lifespan. And so there's been a lot of interest in how emotional states are shared within close relationships, right? And you can certainly imagine whether it's sort of contagiously positive moods or a state of gloom that descends over a group of people, that we share our emotional states with the people that surround us. But as we have advanced in our technology to kind of look under the skin, look at what's happening to the brain, look at what's happening to the body, we can see that there are examples of physiological linkage between ourselves and our close relationship partners as well. So that's what I've focused my career on studying and trying to understand.
That's really interesting. So, how do you test that? How do you get into something?
Yeah, so I'm a cortisol researcher. So cortisol is a stress hormone. It's produced when the hypothalamus detects a stressor or a threat in the environment, talks to the pituitary, which in turn talks to the adrenal gland. So that's the HPA, hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis. And the HPA axis produces its end product in humans is cortisol. And cortisol actually has an inhibitory response and shuts down the stress system. So it's sort of the late stage product of our brain's appraisal of stress. And what's great about cortisol is that you can actually detect it in saliva. So you can detect it in blood, you can detect it in urine, you could detect it in cerebral spinal fluid, but nobody is cruel enough to try to extract CSF from human participants. But you can look at it in saliva, which is great because you can plug it into ambulatory research paradigms. So I got interested in cortisol as a graduate student. I worked on a totally nutty study called the Center for the Everyday Lives of Families at UCLA, where we essentially followed families around to try to chronicle a week in the life of their daily routines. So we videotaped them in their homes. We asked them questions about how they were doing. And we took 4 saliva samples a day for several days. And we were able to assay those saliva samples to look at levels of cortisol. So one of my dissertation projects, and really sort of the first, my first kind of delving into this area of research, was to look at within married couples, if cortisol levels were higher at any given time point, would their partner's cortisol level be higher as well? So did cortisol levels track with each other moment to moment over several days? And I was pleasantly surprised to discover that in fact they did. So it looked as though partners were syncing up using this sort of measure of physiological stress over time, over several days. And we found that the synchrony was highest when couples were actually physically together. So in the morning and in the evening, when partners were in the same environment, they showed higher levels of cortisol linkage than in the samples taken in the middle of the day when they were off at work. These were all dual income spouses who had full-time jobs. So we knew they were out of the house during the day and they were together in the mornings and evenings. And I've since followed up on that study with a number of other studies looking at other kinds of couples, and have consistently found the same thing, sort of no matter how I crunch the data, that it looks like cohabitating couples show positive linkage in levels of cortisol, either in the lab when they're together doing a particular task, or in ambulatory research, which means that we're following them around in the home environment over some extended period of time. So that's the kind of research I've done. Other researchers have asked the same kind of question, but have used other methods to get under the skin. So for example, tracking sympathetic nervous system arousal. So you can look at heart rate. You can look at vagoregulation, which has to do with parasympathetic regulatory functioning of the cardiovascular system. You can look at sympathetic arousal through skin conductance, right? So a lot of different ways to sort of look at to what extent is somebody physiologically aroused, and have found similar things, right? When you put people together and you wire them up to kind of measure their ambulatory physiology, they're more likely to become synchronized when they're engaged in some kind of conversation or some kind of interaction. Even just when you ask a couple to synchronize their breathing, or to lock eyes, right? So there are sort of ways to experimentally increase the degree to which you can detect physiological linkage, but it has all kinds of interesting ramifications for the therapist-client relationship, for the roommate relationship, for peer relationships, for workplace relationships. I've mostly studied it in a couple context, and then also in terms of looking at parent-child dyads.
That's really interesting.
Yeah.
Sort of maybe back up.
I was going to even say, because you were asking about methods, I just talked about cortisol and about sympathetic nervous system, like heart rate, but you can also look at testosterone, which is a gonadal hormone. So I've actually looked at couples' levels of testosterone over the course of pregnancy, and found that when fathers showed more closely linked testosterone levels with their partners, they actually reported more investment in the partner relationship following the birth of their child. People have also looked at linkage in oxytocin, which is another sort of social affiliative neuropeptide. And you can also do this thing called hyperscanning, which allows you to look at linkage at the neural level. So scanning people's brains, and looking to see to what extent are neurons sort of firing in synchronized patterns. So sorry to interrupt, I just thought of a few more methodologies that are really promising to explore these questions.
That's really fascinating. So, but just to, for me, just to back up, so you're measuring, what you're doing is measuring cortisol in couples, which is a cortisol stress regulator, and seeing it sort of sync up throughout the day.
Yes.
So I guess one of the questions I may want to ask, you're also measuring their sort of experienced feelings of stress, their moods and that kind of thing? Are those syncing up as well in the same type of patterns?
Yeah, so great question. So in the dissertation study I mentioned, where we were looking at couples in daily life, we asked them not only to sample their saliva, we also asked them to report on their mood states. So they literally circled adjectives that reflected how they were feeling at sort of any given time point across these 12 time points during the 3 days that they participated in the study. And what we found was that couples actually did show synchrony in their negative mood states, but not their positive mood states. And that's been found in other studies looking at emotion transmission within families, that we tend to be more contagious when it comes to our negative moods. There's some evidence that positive mood states might be more contagious in sort of peer groups and friendship groups, but we tend to be really good at translating negative moods to people in our closest relationships, like our families. And that actually makes a lot of adaptive sense. If you think about the fact that, one benefit of the group is, as a survival function, you have one person scanning the environment for threat. rather than everybody having to be vigilant to do that. And so if we're really good at conveying sort of stress or threat to other people, that allows people to sort of muster their defenses and prepare for anything problematic. So there's a theory called social baseline theory, which was developed by James Cone at the University of Virginia, which actually talks about the idea that our brains expend more energy when we're alone rather than when we're with other people. And it's because in part of, you know, the sort of social load sharing of things like being vigilant to threat, foraging for resources, right? All of the things that we evolved to do in order to survive are much easier done in a group than individually. Even parenting is very much, you know, there's a term called alloparenting, which was introduced by Sarah Hrdy, who's an anthropologist. And that really refers to the fact that children were meant to be raised by groups of people. Not so much, you know, we often have the sort of ideal of the single parent, single child dyad that's very close and enmeshed, but, you know, lots of people take on a parenting role in a small community, like the kinds of communities that we evolved to survive in, right? So being able to transmit our emotional states and even our physiological states, you know, allows us to sort of succeed in these kinds of group environments, which are the environments that we really evolved to thrive in.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So is there a sort of a one-to-one relationship between these emotional states and these physiological states? So if my cortisol levels are high, does that mean I'm definitely stressed and really grumpy? And sort of the converse, if I'm feeling a lot of stress, can I be sure if we were to look under the skin that well, I mean, but would there be a lot of cortisol there, or is it more fluid than that?
Right. So that's the idea, and yet it's surprisingly rarely found that mood states and physiological states track each other perfectly. I mean, that's sort of the premise underlying a lot of the stress research, is that cortisol is going to reflect how we're feeling and what kinds of stressors are in our environment. But that hasn't necessarily been borne out. So some people are actually very poor self-reporters of their own sort of internal mood states. And there's even sort of an interesting research literature around this idea of mismatch between how you say you're feeling and what your body is telling us, right? So that people might be, you know, physiologically looking very stressed and be reporting that they feel absolutely fine, or they could be reporting a lot of distress and look physiologically calm. And that might have to do with just the extent to which people are good at sort of their own interoceptive awareness, right? Like some people are sort of better readers of their own physiology than others. It might also just be that our methods are still pretty fuzzy and messy, right? Like cortisol can reflect a lot of things. It can reflect whether you ate a meal in the last hour. It can reflect whether you drank coffee. It can reflect your physical activity. So this is noisy research. And although, you know, a lot of cortisol research starts with the idea that cortisol reflects your psychological stress state, there are many other drivers of cortisol levels.
That's really interesting. So maybe one of the takeaways here, not only that if my partner is in potentially a bad mood, I might sync up and also get in a bad mood, but that I might not even feel like I'm in a bad mood if I'm not necessarily sort of reporting in that sort of one-to-one way, but it will still have a physiological effect on me that being stressed would, and in any case.
Yeah, exactly.
We're sort of syncing up.
Yeah, and I think that gives us an illustration for why stress can be corrosive to relationships and to people's health, even if it's not consciously so, right? Like you're saying, you know, maybe I can pick up on my partner's bad day at work or grumpy mood, you know, even if I have this sort of, you know, rationale that it shouldn't affect me, there's some level at which it's going to shape my physiology, right? Because again, it is adaptive. We're built to detect the states of people around us. And that's certainly true if you imagine that, you know, infants are more likely to survive if they're really good at figuring out how their caregivers are feeling and what they as infants need to do to elicit the kind of care that they need, right? And so there's some research on infants whose parents are depressed or anxious or under stress, and how that might affect the child's own sort of developing physiology and emotional well-being. Yeah, and in that case, again, it may sort of go beyond what the infant is consciously picking up on, right? Like a 1-year-old might not be able to say, oh, my mother is clinically depressed and therefore I shouldn't let her mood states affect me, right? No, instead that infant is, going to be totally symbiotically linked to that parent, and is going to be sort of, shaped by the kinds of emotional cues that they're getting as they develop their own emotional repertoire.
Yeah, and so, something else you've reported in your research is that couples in particular, so maybe not the infant-parent relationship, but couples who are especially synced up on cortisol levels so report lower satisfaction rates in their overall relationship. So if we're really on the same page, we're actually in bad shape.
Right. And this is something that really surprised me when I started to do this research, because, I sort of subscribe to the idea that if we're really attuned to somebody, then that's a beneficial sign that we have a really close, well-functioning relationship, right? And that was exactly the opposite of what we found. In my dissertation research, we found that when couples reported more marital distress, they showed higher levels of synchrony in cortisol and in negative mood. And it made sense when we thought about the fact that, cortisol as a stress hormone is really reflecting the extent to which, people are feeling overwhelmed or under threat and sharing those states with other people. That may not be a sign of a well-functioning relationship. And in fact, I think when we consider what an adaptive relationship looks like when you come home after a bad day at work, you don't necessarily want a partner who's going to match that state, right? You might want somebody who can modulate that state and help you calm down, help sort of restore you to a better functioning baseline, right?
Balance each other out a little bit.
Yeah, exactly. So if you think about sort of converging around a homeostatic baseline, right? Like we are very homeostatic organisms. We like to regulate around set points that feel optimal for us, whether you're talking about temperature or appetite or sleep or arousal or mood or physiology. And so to whatever extent our partner can help us reach that homeostatic baseline, which may in fact be a shared baseline within close relationships, that's beneficial. And so I found that with my dissertation, that couples who were more linked in physiology and mood were also more distressed, and then found that again in another sample of low-income couples who were parents of an infant. And in that case, we actually found that when the couple reported higher levels of intimate partner aggression over the previous year, they showed stronger linkage in cortisol. So suggesting that when couples are really reactive to each other's stress states, that may be linked not only with sort of a negative relationship quality, but even a more aggressive, conflictual kind of relationship. So it seems problematic. So my thinking about this is that it's normative within close relationships that we have some shared physiology, but there's maybe an extent to which we can become overreactive or over-responsive to each other. And that tips the balance away from being adaptive and towards kind of driving our set point to a place that isn't helpful to us.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So I'm thinking now about the ways in which we're reactive to each other. So in your description for the talk and in your research, you use the word entrainment, how we become entrained with the biology of others. And my familiarity with the term comes from maybe physics, where you think of two pendulums suspended from a board that are set to swing, and eventually they'll sync up, either in phase or out of phase, I think, but they'll eventually be sort of synced. And it's through my understanding, is sort of vibrations sort of in the board and finding this sort of equilibrium. That's a terrible physics explanation, but
no, that's good. I like that. Yeah.
Not a physicist.
Well, that metaphor is borrowed often by psychologists. So
Okay, yeah.
You're on the right
track. So you also use the term sort of synchronization as this maybe broader sort of umbrella term for it. So I'm curious if what the relationship there is, or what you mean by entrainment, or how we think about how this sort of connection happens on a more sort of technical level.
Yeah. So there's a small research literature that's looked at this question of linkage or synchrony within close relationships. And it has so many different terms that there's probably a different term for every paper that's been published, right? So people have talked about co-regulation, attunement, synchrony, convergence, covariation, a dozen others that I'm not remembering. And, you know, each of those terms sort of refers to a maybe slightly different kind of relationship between, you know, people's states, right? So you mentioned like in phase or out of phase coordination, right? And so, you know, one question is, are you talking about sort of homeostatic co-regulation, which is to say, at the same time, we're synced up with somebody. So if I have higher cortisol right now, do you have higher cortisol right now? There's also the idea of contagion or transmission, which is to say, if I have higher cortisol right now, will you have higher cortisol 15 minutes from now, right? At the next time that I sample your saliva, not right now, but in 15 minutes when your saliva has caught up with your physiological activation, right? So, so that suggests that there's some sort of direction of effects, that there's a driver and there's a follower, there's a leader and a follower, which is really sort of different from people who are just linked up at the same time point, right? Because if you're linked up with somebody at the same time point, you might just be reacting to kind of a shared context. If you're linked up with somebody at the following time point, that might suggest that you're actually influenced by that person. And in my research, I found evidence for both kinds of linkage. And so, you know, the other question is, are you sort of positively linked with somebody? So like I said, higher cortisol in me, higher cortisol in you, or can you be sort of out of phase linked? Higher cortisol in me means lower cortisol in you, right? And maybe that's what's adaptive. One of my grad students just published a paper where he looked at couples' heart rate during a loss discussion. So this was a really innovative paradigm developed by my postdoc mentor, Gayla Margolin, where she had couples get together, have a conversation about a personal loss. One person talked about their loss and the other member of the couple was supposed to listen and kind of provide support. And my student found that when couples showed greater empathy, or rather when the listener showed greater empathy to their partner who was telling about the loss, they actually showed less positive linkage in heart rate during those moments, right? So that sort of goes back to this idea of maybe you want somebody who is, you know, balancing our arousal level rather than somebody who's matching, right? So the terminology can kind of get at some of these subtle dynamics, but this is really an evolving field of research. And so we're kind of still hammering out what are the right words to use to describe these processes.
Do we have a sense of sort of the mechanisms that are driving these different types of synchronization or synchronization in general?
Yeah, I think there, again, as with terminology, there are lots of explanations, right? But in terms of, you know, when you're talking about cohabiting people, you have shared environments, shared routines. So in some of my studies, I bring couples or parents and children into the lab and have them do some kind of discussion, right? And the idea is discuss a problem in your relationship in a way that you might at home. So in that case, when people are showing linkage in physiology, it may be because they're reacting to the same context, the laboratory setting, the same topics that might be topics that are upsetting. And so, you know, the mechanism is really like, what is the content of this discussion and what does it mean for these partners? In other cases, when you're looking at patterns in daily life, you might think about, you know, shared routines, shared sleeping environment, shared bedtime and waking time, shared meal times, right? Shared activities. All of these things can influence, you know, cortisol has a certain rhythm across the day. It has a diurnal rhythm. And the shape of that rhythm turns out to be important for health. And the shape of that rhythm is also linked to not only stress, but also sleep and meals and other kinds of routines. So when you're sharing those routines, that's going to lead to some greater sort of similarity, right, in those levels between partners. But there's also, you know, what are we showing people with our gestures, with our facial expressions, with our tone of voice, with, you know, the pitch of our voice. There are lots of ways, again, we talked about why it's adaptive in our evolutionary history for us to really be able to pick up on the stress states of others. And there are a lot of subtle ways in which we might broadcast those without even being aware of them, right? You can often tell if somebody's in a bad mood just by the way they butter a piece of toast without that person even using words to communicate that. So, I think there's a lot of interesting research ahead of us in terms of figuring out, how do those subtle behaviors influence our ability to pick up on other people's states. And even, pheromones, right? Do we smell different when we're under stress? Do we, excrete different microbiota, right? There are a lot of interesting mechanisms that I think we're just beginning to scratch the surface of.
Yeah, that's fascinating. So it looks like we have just a handful of minutes left. So speaking of sort of future research, where do you think this is all headed? Maybe that's a good way to begin to wrap up. What's next?
Yeah.
Research.
Yeah, I think there's so much that we don't understand. And part of it is because we're just getting the tools to really look under the skin and look at physiology, look at the brain. So as those tools get more sophisticated and as our statistics get more sophisticated, we can ask more and more interesting questions. I think for me personally, I'm really interested in how does physiological linkage change across the lifespan, from infancy to dating relationships, to marriage, to transition to parenthood, which is what I'm focusing on now because I think it's a particularly dynamic time, to, old age and caregiving relationships, right? What happens when you're caring for someone at the end of life who might be sick or disabled? How does that influence your own physiology? And so sort of looking at how linkage changes according to context and according to lifespan is a really interesting question. And tied to that question is, what's the adaptive or functional significance of linkage, right? Maybe when you're becoming a parent, having hormonal synchrony within a couple relationship is valuable because, in some ways it might be helping the father prepare to parent, right? If he's sort of picking up on the hormonal changes that his partner is undergoing as part of pregnancy. Maybe strong synchrony is not adaptive in other kinds of contexts. Like I mentioned, caregiving for a sick or disabled spouse, right? That might be different in terms of its implications for health. So I think we need to understand, what we know, like I said at the beginning, relationships really matter for health. What is it about linking up with people in our environment that might shift that, either for good or for ill? And then finally, what are the interventions that we can develop when, either partners are overly physiologically reactive to each other in ways that are not adaptive? Can we help sort of add some flexibility to the system and get out of these repertoires of responding to each other that are sort of overly entrained? That's something that many family therapists are already doing, but can we do it while also looking at physiology? Or are there other kinds of interventions that maybe help people whose physiology is not linked at all to, develop some more closeness and attunement if that's adaptive in other kinds of contexts? So I think, can we change linkage within couples? How does it change naturally across the lifespan? And what does it actually mean? Are some very small questions that are yet to be explored.
It sounds fascinating, though, and sort of reaches into both our sort of understanding of ourselves scientifically and our practical needs in our everyday lives. So
yeah, absolutely.
That sounds really interesting. Thank you. I think that's pretty much all the time we have. So thank you, Dr. Saxbe, for speaking with us today. If people are interested in learning more about your research and what you're up to, where can they go? Where can they find out more about your work?
So they can find my website at USC. It's dornsife.usc.edu/nestlab. So it's the Nest Lab at USC, and there are some links to papers if people want to read. And, I can't take credit for even like a tiny fraction of the research being done in this area. So, there's also a lot of other researchers who are doing interesting work that, a really sort of dedicated afternoon on Google scholar can help to turn up.
Well, thank you. And thank you again for being with us and getting our colloquia off to such a strong start. It's been a delight speaking with you.
Yeah, it's such a pleasure to speak to you too.
And for everyone watching, thank you for joining us as well. We hope you enjoyed the discussion. If you haven't seen our website, please check it out, sempercurious.com. And if you're not already signed up, please sign up for our newsletter. It's the best way to find out about our upcoming events, the next colloquia, new articles, that kind of thing. We'll be announcing the next speaker, our next guest, and date of our next colloquium very soon. So keep an eye out for that, and have a great weekend.